From the Ash Rises a Phoenix, Chapter 12. Written by Kangarooney. Who the fuck did Eren Yeager think he was? Ever since the beginning of the 104th training, Yeager had been a no-name, bland, going-to-fail-out, not-worth-knowing brat. He had stuck to himself, skulked around at night, and lagged behind all of the other recruits without a single word. Then, one day, he'd gone from shoveling food into his mouth like he was about to starve and eyeing every person like they were dangerous, to quietly enjoying his meals with the wiry Dennis Lewert. Not that Jean paid either of them any attention. No. For some walls-forsaken reason, Marco kept tabs on Yeager and Lewert like they were his long-lost family. Jean trusted Marco's judgment on most points. When it came to worrying over whether Lewert and Yeager felt included in the drills, however, he could care less. Why should they bother over losers who wouldn't make it to the end? The few times Jean interacted with either one of them, he was left with a bad taste in his mouth. Lewert looked like a rat, which meant he probably was a rat. Yeager spoke very little for all the smack he talked. That is, Jean tried to show him how dumb he was for sticking around when he was clearly a layabout. Then Yeager would spit back, "We'll see who's right," and turn his nose up and bite back anything further. But his eyes could never hide his distaste. Which brought Jean back to wondering who the fuck Eren Yeager thought he was. The shithead despised Jean upon their first meeting, and Jean couldn't figure out why. What the hell had Jean Kirstein ever done to Eren fucking Yeager that made quiet Yeager, bite my tongue Yeager, failure Yeager decide that Jean was worth so much less than him? Fucking Yeager, who never quite said which branch he wanted to be in. Fucking Yeager, who, somehow, despite all bets against him, made it to the top 10 of the 104th squad. Fucking Yeager, whose eyes were softer when he looked at Jean at the end of their time together, who somehow grew on Jean, regardless of Jean's attempts to ignore the spindly boy. Fucking Yeager, who went from Marco's pet project to sort of okay in Jean's eyes, to fucking Yeager, who wasn't even Jean's friend. Why the hell did Eren Yeager sacrifice himself to save Jean? 2 weeks had passed since the abnormals attacked Trost. 2 weeks had passed since Jean looked death in the eye and knew he wouldn't win. 2 weeks had passed since Eren fucking Yeager. 1 week had passed since the list of dead was released. Wasn't Yeager from Shiganshina? 2 weeks had passed. The invasion of Trost was the single most horrifying day of Jean's entire life. He'd never planned to join the garrison or the Survey Corps. Jean wanted to join the military police, a guaranteed easy job maintaining peace among the inner walls. Jean never planned to look at a Titan and put the skills he learned to the test. Jean was meant to deal with people, not with monsters who ate them. The invasion of Trost was the single most horrifying day of Jean's life. And yet, when he slept, Jean didn't see the blood-spattered streets, the discarded human limbs, or the glazed look of defeat. No. Every time Jean slept, he saw the same scene on repeat. He fled to the air depot with Thomas and Mina. A glinting grin, a flash of teeth, and screaming. Thomas and Mina devoured before he could blink. Jean on a rooftop, a Titan reaching for him. The crushing pressure of an enormous hand, his ribs cracking under the weight. The open, lidless eye and manic grin. The realization that Jean was going to die. Then, a quick release of pressure, and Jean fell from the sky back to the rooftop. His sides bruised, the hypnosis released. He looked up to see what happened, only to see his savior already in the beast's mouth. Eren Yeager. Jean remembered rolling to his feet. He remembered the explosive burst of adrenaline and how he reached his hand out as if he could grab Eren's own. He remembered Eren saying, "Live," and the Titan swallowing him down. Jean watched the lump travel down the throat and into the Titan's stomach. The monster then turned its face back to Jean, and Jean, he woke up. He stared at the dark ceiling of his quarters. "Live," Eren Yeager said. "Live." Wasn't Jaeger from Shiganshina? Did he live the life he wanted before giving it up for Jean? Jean owed Jaeger a life debt, and he couldn't even repay the bastard. How the hell could Aaron fucking Jaeger, who once despised Jean Kirstein to the point where his eyes spoke louder than his mouth, possibly see Jean's peril and make a split-second decision that placed Jean as important enough to live? What did he want from Jean? Jaeger told him to live. What kind of life did Jaeger want to live? What meant the most to him? How could Jean possibly live up to his expectations when the few people who knew Jaeger well were among the list of dead? Aaron Jaeger, as a member of the top 10, could easily have joined the military police and lived a life of safety. As a former citizen of Shiganshina, he never would have had to face Titans again. He wouldn't have to worry about seeing his friends devoured, like a member of the Survey Corps would. He wouldn't have to patrol the walls or ever look a Titan in the face again, like a garrison member would. All Jaeger had to do was ignore Jean's peril and survive a little longer. He could have made it a few more hours. That's all it took for the other abnormal to save Trost. Jaeger could have lived instead. Why was it up to Jean to live a life worth two people? When everyone regrouped at the depot, when it was confirmed that no new Titans entered Trost, and instead they'd won the city back, Commander Pixis had taken control. They'd begun cleanup operations. First, they went through the city and ensured every remaining Titan was dead. This process was accelerated by members of the Survey Corps who'd stayed behind from their current expedition. Jean didn't know or care what expedition number it was. Second, they began scouring the city for any survivors. There were very few, some hidden in basements, others hidden among the trampled. Many of those survivors were injured. Most refused to live. Third, once they determined there were no more survivors, a muster was called. A list of dead was made. Marco had looked pained at the reading of Jaeger's name. Jean wouldn't have cared, even if it weren't for what the asshole did. Their graduation was postponed until tomorrow. Jean's decision should have been easy. He was going to stand on that stage among the top 10, accept his position among the military police, and never look a Titan in the eye again. Maybe Jaeger would have joined up as well. Maybe Jean would have had to accept that good-for-nothing Jaeger was in fact good-for-something Jaeger. Jean couldn't sleep. Jaeger's actions and Jaeger's last word kept him up. Live. Fuck. Jean rubbed the heel of his palm against his face. Fuck me. Fuck you. Fuck. Jean had asked Marco who Jaeger's family was. Who was Jean supposed to approach and apologize to for their son's death? And that's when Jean learned that Aaron fucking Jaeger was from Shiganshina, and he was a fucking orphan. When the cadets were given leave during their training, Jean went straight home to visit his ma and pa. Where did Jaeger go? Why did Jean care? Neither of Jean's parents were lost during Trost's invasion. They escaped quickly. He found them among the refugees. Jean's house was still standing. After a little cleanup, it's like nothing ever happened. Jean lost nothing except his sanity from this calamity. Aaron Jaeger, a survivor of Shiganshina, a casualty of Trost, a member of the 104th Cadet Corps, a top 10 graduate, a man, who saw death and refused to bow down, who chose to fight back. That's who expected Jean Kirstein to live a quality life. What was a quality life for Aaron Jaeger, who'd already lost everything? Jean wanted to roll to his side, to curl up in a fetal position, to grab his knees and hug himself, but he couldn't. His ribs were bruised, his shoulders still sprained from that moment. Jean rested in a medical room, while Aaron rested among the dead. No one mourned Aaron Jaeger. His name was meant to be forgotten. How could Jean Kirstein possibly forget Aaron Jaeger when Aaron Jaeger was the reason Jean Kirstein was able to remember? Jean Kirstein planned to join the military police, to enjoy his life, to know safety and security. He joined the Cadet Corps when he was old enough to sign up. Jean Kirstein was friends with Margot Bott. They planned to join the military police together. When Jean Kirstein went on leave, he visited his ma and pa, settled down for dinner, and complained when his ma nagged him about his weight, blushed when she squeezed his arms and pinched his cheeks. Jean Kirstein wanted to make his pa proud. Pa was a member of the garrison and managed to work his way into a position that kept them well fed and healthy. Jean could remember when Wal Maria fell. His ma and Pa forced him to stay inside for 2 weeks straight. Ma would wring her apron and beg Pa to lend a hand. Pa always said, "Only a little, Marie. The food will run out." Then there was the day Pa came home, uniform dirty and eyes shadowed. Jean didn't understand then, and doesn't understand now. Pa said, "They're sending them out." Ma started to cry, and Jean stared with wide eyes at Ma, then Pa. Ma said, "Why, Francis, why?" And Pa said, "There's too many mouths, Marie. If they stay, no one will live." Jean tried to sneak out, but Pa always caught him. He popped his ears and told him to help his ma. By the time Jean was allowed to roam Trost's streets once more, the level of activity had decreased. There were more beggars in the streets, more unkempt children running around. Crime increased as the population of the impoverished grew. Jean can remember meeting up with Marco and saying, "We need to join the MPs to put order back in our homes." And Marco said, yes. He agreed that Trost used to be safer. Jean placed both his hands over his face and groaned. He didn't want to think anymore. If he considered what Ma and Pa had spoken about those years ago, then he might realize that something awful happened, even after Maria fell. Who was Aaron Yeager? What made him choose to survive when he was faced with death and destruction? Why was his last word a plea for Jean to live? How could he possibly think a life was worth living without anyone to share it with? Yeager survived the fall of Shiganshina, only to fall in Trost. Many of Trost's citizens who survived wandered the streets with numb bodies and blank eyes. There were refugee camps set up in the interior of Rosa for those who were too scared to return to Trost. As much as Jean resented the nagging thought, he had to face the facts. When Shiganshina fell, very few civilians made it out. More numerous were those who lived just outside of the walls of Maria, those who lived along the waterways, and those whose towns communicated via carrier pigeons. If the garrison were properly trained, then such a disastrous event would call for every carrier pigeon to be sent out. Rosa's territory was huge, but Maria's had been larger. This meant Trost must have received many refugees. The 2 weeks Jean was kept indoors, Trost must have been bursting at the seams. When Ma and Pa worried over food, the refugees must have been starving in the streets. When Pa came home and spoke with Ma about sending them out, when Jean never saw those hordes of refugees and the food didn't run out. Jean shoved his fingers into his mouth to stifle his urge to scream. He tensed his body and bit on the base of his knuckles. Was their government so cruel they would sacrifice their own civilians? This time, he curled into a ball, ribs be damned. The action sent shooting pain into his chest, and he thought, "Good, distract me." His stomach fluttered, a light ticklish feeling that conflicted with the building knot in his chest. He felt sick. Jean wasn't moving at all, yet when he opened his eyes, he saw amorphous shapes dancing, separating and regrouping. He wheezed, his lungs forcing air out of his constricted chest. He'd been holding the air tightly. Maybe if he stayed in this moment and didn't think, he would reach a full realization of, "Don't do it, Jean." He sucked in a short breath and closed his lips around the fingers still jammed between his teeth. He tightened his fist, rotated it until his thumb pressed firmly below his jaw and squeezed. Don't breathe. Don't think. Don't think. His muscles quivered, and he tensed them harder just to stop. The dancing shapes were being absorbed by an encroaching darkness. The little light cast by low-burning coals in the fireplace vanished as the shadows crept closer in his vision. His free hand rubbed repetitive strokes against the legs, curled to his chest. He focused on those stripes and held his breath. His lungs were burning. They felt like an air canister about to burst from misuse. The knuckles in his mouth brushed against his tongue and stirred a knee-jerk reaction to gag. He immediately spat out his hand and heaved for air. Instead of the desired deep, lung-filling breaths he desired, he couldn't quite control his lungs and realized his heartbeat was incredibly fast. His thoughts whirled. He was a fool. Why? He gasped, between each breath, unable to hold it in any longer. Why? He was hyperventilating. He needed to calm down. There were refugees sent to their deaths. The government he wished to devote himself to, the government whose laws he intended to maintain, murdered refugees. The hand, once stuffed into his mouth, reached up and clasped at his chest. He pounded against his lungs. His arms felt heavy. Swallowing only made his throat scratchier. Even with his eyes wide open, he saw nothing but shadows. The light was gone. I'm a fool. Morning, Jean. Jean opened his eyes to Marco, beaming down at him. Are you excited to graduate? Where was he? He was groggy and his ears felt clogged up. Was he sick? Jean's vision wavered and split. Why are there two of you? His words slurred together. He rubbed his eyes. Jean? He raised his hand and waved at Marco. Sorry, I'm having trouble waking up. Jean, what happened to your hand? Two hands wrapped around his raised one. Jean jerked up in reaction, followed by a groan of pain at the effect on his ribs. Why are there teeth marks on your fingers? Teeth marks? He tugged his hand away from Marco and looked at the red imprints. Why were there teeth marks? His thoughts slowed, like a brain was trying to protect him from something. I'm a fool. No! Everything slammed into his mind once more. He'd realized that the outer walls were slaughtered by their own, and he'd had a panic attack. Jean, what's wrong? Marco was in his face, eyebrows pinched together, lips pursed tight and eyes bright. Stop. Marco, stop. He tugged at his hair and closed his eyes, focusing on the small pricks of pain bouncing around his head. Marco pulled Jean's hands away and then held them tight, forcing Jean to refocus on the other. Deep breaths, Jean. His eyes bore into Jean's own. Steady. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he inhaled and paused, holding the breath for 3 counts, then exhaled. Follow me. He pulled both hands to his own chest so Jean could feel each inflow and outflow. Jean tried. His breath was stuttering, catching in his throat. When he exhaled, an ugly-sounding whine followed. Somehow, his nose was stuffed full of snot. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, exhale. Marco rubbed his thumbs into Jean's wrists. The window was open. The sun was rising. The air was cool. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, exhale. His breathing came a little easier. The snake entangled in his chest was letting go, unwinding. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, exhale. Jean could inhale. He could hold the whole breath. He could exhale. Thank you, he mumbled, casting his eyes away from Marco's piercing look. I'm sorry. You don't have to be, Marco was smiling. Jean didn't need to look to know Marco was smiling. We're best friends, Jean. I'll always be there for you. Jean nodded and pulled his bitten hand away from Marco. He rubbed at his eyes and was startled to see his hand came away wet. Had he cried? It's okay, Marco confirmed his thoughts and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it over. Sorry, and thanks again. He wiped his face down. He felt exhausted, even though he'd just woken up. Fatigue pulled at his eyes and begged him to just lay his head back down and sleep. He could lie down and not think about what caused him to have 2 panic attacks in a single day. He bit his own words back. You don't have to tell me, Jean. I think I understand. You do? Jean snapped his head up to catch Marco pulling away from where he'd been hovering over Jean. Yeah, it's built up stress. So much has happened, and we've barely been given the chance to rest, let alone think. He rubbed his neck. I had a terrible nightmare 2 nights ago. I couldn't eat breakfast, it was so awful. I felt sick to my stomach at the thought of it. Jean hurt. Marco was trying to relate, but he didn't know, and Jean didn't know how he'd break the news to his friend. Though Marco was right about one thing, the idea of any food made Jean's stomach roil in discontent. Yeah, I think if it's okay, I just need to sleep a little bit more. Marco gave a small nod. Wake me up in time to prepare for the ceremony? Of course. Marco rose. He patted Jean's shoulder. I'm here for you, Jean. I know. Thank you, Marco. Jean watched Marco close the door softly. His footsteps softened as he walked away. Jean wouldn't be able to be there for Marco. He could not, would not, join the military police. If there was any part of the military that agreed with inner wall decisions, it would be the military police. Their entire purpose was to maintain order by any means necessary, apparently. He didn't know where he would go, just not the military police. Jaeger wanted him to live. Jean would live and fight. He was never going to let another citizen be forced to leave the safety of the walls. Never again.